Chapter 13. Eloise's idle wanderings through the cobwebbed corridors of the Crown estate had led her to a narrow, spiraling staircase that led up to the attic. Her curiosity had her climbing the stairs. She brushed aside the curtain of dust that seemed to shroud the past, her fingers tracing the grain of the wooden banister, aged and worn like the secrets it kept. As she emerged into the attic, she spotted an oddity, an unassuming tapestry that hung askew on the far wall. She approached. A gentle tug and the tapestry fell away, revealing a door so cleverly concealed that one might think it the stuff of fanciful tales, and not the stark reality in which it stood. Eloise turned the handle and stepped inside. The hidden chamber was a trove of whispers made tangible. Maps unfurled across tables depicted regions fraught with tension between Theron and Allenia, lines drawn in bold strokes, marking territories and strategies. Documents, some with seals broken in haste, littered every surface, and more curiously, a collection of items one might find in the hands of rebels, daggers with hilts worn from use, missives scrawled in code, and banners filled with dissidents. Eloise's throat tightened as her gaze fell upon a parchment that bore a wax seal she knew all too well, the crest of Bernard, her husband. Her fingers, which only moments ago danced with the thrill of discovery, now hesitated. She unfolded the letter with care. "Dearest Bernard," the script began. The words that followed wove a tale of conspiracy and brotherhood, hinting at Bernard's role amidst the unrest, his name entwined with those who challenged the crown's authority. How could the man who held her with such tender affection by night plot with shadows by day? Yet here lay evidence that clawed at the very fabric of her trust, demanding she face the possibility that her marriage was entangled in a web far more complex than the union of two hearts. "Bernard, what have you done?" she whispered to the emptiness, half expecting the walls to answer the question that burned upon her tongue. Her mind, a battlefield of love and suspicion, grappled with the notion that the man she shared her soul with could harbor secrets dark enough to tear nations apart. Eloise folded the letter with a delicacy that contradicted the chaos churning within her chest. She tucked the parchment into the folds of her dress, a weight heavier than its physical presence warranted, and stepped back into the light, her heart encased in ice, her resolve steeled for the confrontation that awaited. "Could I have truly been so naive?" she murmured under her breath. Her marriage now appeared a mere facade, a chessboard upon which Bernard might have played her for a queen when she was but a pawn. Shaking off the paralysis of shock, Eloise delved deeper into the trove of treachery that surrounded her. She sifted through maps dotted with pins and strings that connected them. Then, amid the chaos, she found them, scraps of paper filled with cryptic symbols and numbers, a language of secrecy that whispered of her husband's hidden allegiances. Deciphering this would require an enigma, she scoffed, the humor bitter on her tongue as she tucked the coded messages beside the letter against her heart, a heart that pounded an erratic rhythm of dread and determination. With resolve fueling her actions, Eloise descended the attic stairs, unsure if she should hate herself for not trusting her husband or if she should be angry with him for not being trustworthy. In Bernard's study, her gaze swept across the room, alighting upon the bookshelf that housed volumes of history and philosophy. But today, her attention was drawn not to the wisdom of the ages, but to the possibility of deceit hidden within the grain of the wood. come out, wherever you are," she sang softly, her fingers gliding along the spines until they paused, feeling a subtle discrepancy, a book slightly out of place. With a gentle tug, the shelf gave way, revealing a compartment that chilled her to the bone. Inside lay documents stamped with the royal seal, their contents detailing troop movements and supply lines, information only a traitor would hoard. "Bernard, what web of lies have we become entangled in?" Eloise whispered to the silent room. She gathered the incriminating evidence, her arms cradling the papers as if they were fragile relics, each one a shard of the life she thought she knew. As she stood amidst the trappings of power and privilege, Eloise grappled with a truth that threatened to unravel her world, an enigma wrapped in regal robes, a husband cloaked in conspiracy. Eloise swept into the room where he met with other officials, her arms burdened with the trove of secrets she had unearthed. Bernard sat behind his mahogany desk. "Bernard," she began, her voice betraying the storm of emotions swirling within her. "We need to talk." He looked up, a smile playing on his lips. "My dear, what's brought on this sudden solemnity?" he asked, rising to meet her. "Explain this," she demanded, laying the documents before him like cards on a table, each one an accusation. Her hands still trembled from fury. "Tell me these are forgeries, that there is some rational explanation why my husband harbors the whispers of traitors." Bernard's eyes widened as they scanned the papers, and Eloise watched as a kaleidoscope of emotions flickered across his features. Surprise gave way to confusion, and then to concern. He straightened up, meeting her gaze squarely. "Eloise, I swear to you, I know nothing of this. It must be a misunderstanding." "Must it?" she countered. "Or is it merely inconvenient that your wife discovered your clandestine affairs?" "Eloise, please." Bernard reached out to her, but Eloise recoiled, stepping back as if his very touch might taint her with treason. "You have to believe me. I would never do anything to harm either of our kingdoms." "Wouldn't you?" Eloise pressed. "For politics? For power? Or perhaps for sheer sport, because what is love if not another battlefield strewn with the casualties of trust?" Her wit, usually a source of shared laughter between them, cut through the air, sharp and cold. Bernard's face was a tapestry of bewilderment, his usual composure frayed at the edges. "I am innocent, Eloise. You must believe me." "Belief," she sighed. "Once given freely, now a currency I'm loath to spend without proof of its worth." Eloise's heart ached with the weight of suspicion, and despite her desire to see innocence in Bernard's eyes, the seeds of doubt had taken root. She needed the truth yet feared it might be the very thing that would tear their world apart. Asterisk. Eloise stood alone in her private chambers. She sat at her ornate mahogany desk. With a tentative click, she initiated the video call. "Good evening, Eloise." Amanda's image flickered to life, her voice warm yet laced with concern. "You have that look, what weighs so heavily upon your heart?" Eloise drew a deep breath, her chest heaving with the burden of unspoken fears. "It's Bernard," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid the very walls might betray her. "I've stumbled upon something troubling." Amanda leaned forward, her eyes attentive and kind. "Tell me." "I'm happy to listen." The words tumbled from Eloise's lips, each one heavy with uncertainty. The hidden room, the maps, the documents, and the letter, all laid bare before Amanda's sympathetic gaze. As she spoke, Eloise's fingers fidgeted with the pearl necklace at her throat, a gift from Bernard on their wedding day. "Trust is needed for a marriage to work," Amanda counseled, her voice steady as the ancient oaks that lined the palace grounds. "But instincts are the whispers of our soul. Listen to them." "Yet how do I know if he's telling me the truth?" Eloise lamented, her gaze dropping to the keyboard, where her fingers danced nervously upon the keys. "By remembering that you need to guard your heart." Amanda's reply was a balm against the darkness. Their conversation waned, but the uneasy sensation within Eloise swelled as the night grew deeper. She bid Amanda farewell, the finality of the call leaving her feeling more isolated than before. Eloise wrapped herself in a velvet robe and made her way to the window. The hours melded into a tapestry of restless thoughts. Should she confront Bernard once more? Was it crazy to hope for an explanation that would help her understand? Or should she seek counsel from James and Theodore, whose loyalty she knew would never waver? Each time she pictured Bernard's face, his plea for belief, Eloise felt the sharp sting of betrayal's arrow. Yet, when she envisioned the kingdom they had sworn to serve together, her resolve hardened like the diamond in her engagement ring. Asterisk. Eloise slipped through the trimmed hedges of the garden. The estate, usually a bastion of tranquility, now seemed to mock her with its serene beauty. She clutched the bundle of evidence to her chest, the papers rustling like discreet whispers of conspiracy against the soft rustle of her skirts. Theodore awaited her at the garden's center, his figure a steadfast oak in a grove of uncertainty. As siblings, they shared the same eyes that mirrored the stormy seas, but where Eloise's gaze often danced with laughter, Theodore's held a depth of solemnity. "Teddy," she greeted him, the childhood nickname slipping out in a moment of vulnerability. The sound of it seemed to break the ice of formality that her fears had built. "Ellie," he replied. He took in her disheveled appearance, a rare sight for the meticulously poised princess, with a brother's discernment. "Walk with me," she implored, leading him toward a secluded alcove. Under the guise of casual sauntering, Eloise unfolded the parchment that had set her world askew. "Look at this," she said. Theodore studied the letter, his expression shifting from bewilderment to dawning realization. "This is addressed to Bernard," he murmured, the weight of implication anchoring his words. "Yes," Eloise replied, her lips a tight line. "And it suggests his hand may be stirring the cauldron of dissent. He could be behind Nicole's kidnapping." "Bernard has always been ambitious," Theodore mused, handing back the letter. "But treason? It's a huge leap from the man we know. He cannot fake the way he looks at you when he doesn't think you're looking." "Which is why I am adrift in a sea of doubts," Eloise confessed, the humor that once buoyed her spirits now drowned by the gravity of her predicament. "More information is needed before we jump to conclusions," Theodore said. "We have to be careful, Ellie. If these accusations are true, we're not merely discussing the fate of a marriage, but the fate of two kingdoms." "Then you'll stand with me?" she asked. "Always," he affirmed with a brotherly squeeze of her hand. "We need to proceed with caution. And stealth. Definitely stealth. I shall endeavor to channel my inner espionage heroine. Although, I doubt even she faced such a tangled web. Remember, Ellie," Theodore added, the corners of his mouth twitching upwards, "it's always the quiet ones you need to watch. Quiet like Bernard, or quiet like the librarian who turned out to be a secret agent in The Lurking Scholar." "Perhaps a bit of both," he chuckled. Eloise was sad to see her brother leave. Nothing was making sense in her world. Eloise's fingers danced over the spines of ancient tomes lining the library's secret alcove, a clandestine meeting spot she and James had agreed upon. "Remember," James murmured, pulling a map from within a hollowed book, "the eyes of the court are curious. We must be the shadow that moves unseen." "Shadows with an appetite for intrigue," Eloise quipped, a smirk playing on her lips, despite the gravity of their task. "We'll gather the crumbs of truth, without raising an alarm. Like mice in a pantry." "Quite poetic," James retorted with a chuckle. "I do hope we're a bit scarier than rodents." Their plan unfurled like the map before them, each location marked as a potential rendezvous for the dissidents. They would send people they knew they could trust to serve as spies, so they could be certain of Bernard's intentions. Every nod, every lingering glance, Eloise recited. "Yes," James replied, his eyes narrowing. "And Bernard, I think you should talk to him about it. I cannot believe he's part of this." "Bernard," she sighed, the name now a cipher unto itself, a puzzle she yearned yet feared to solve. "You're right. I think I should trust him, but I need to understand his reasoning first." With their alliance sealed, Eloise returned to the labyrinth of corridors that made up the palace, her senses heightened. At dinner, she watched Bernard trade barbs with courtiers, his laughter too hearty, his smiles a shade too rehearsed. She catalogued each interaction, filing them away to dissect later under the cover of night. "Is everything all right, Eloise?" Bernard asked, his gaze locking onto hers across the ornate table setting. "Never better," she lied smoothly, dabbing the corners of her mouth with a napkin. Her heart hammered against her ribcage, a prisoner to her duplicity. "Your cheeks are flushed. A sign of good health or a mind preoccupied?" King Philip inquired, peering at her with a grandfatherly concern that tugged at her conscience. Perhaps a bit of both, Eloise deflected with a grace she scarcely felt. The change of seasons always ignites a fire within me. Ah, the fervor of youth, the king mused. Or the burn of curiosity, Bernard added. Curiosity, Eloise echoed, a faint smile touching her lips. It does tend to keep one awake at night. Then may your dreams be tranquil tonight, Bernard said. Eloise nodded, her resolve hardening like the jewels adorning her gown. She would find the truth hidden beneath the veneer of royal pleasantries. For Theron, for her peace of mind, and perhaps for the love she still hoped was real. Eloise traced the intricate patterns of the tapestry that hung in the grand hallway, her fingertips skimming over the threads as if she could unravel the secrets woven into its design. With each step she took, the echo of her heels against the marble floor seemed to punctuate the growing rift between her and Bernard. Dinner had been an excruciating affair, with laughter that never quite reached the eyes. They were actors on a stage where the script had been lost, fumbling through their lines with feigned ignorance of the audience's discerning gaze. Bernard, Eloise began, pausing near the grand staircase where he stood. Her voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of emotion that threatened to breach the dam of her composure. We need to speak. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Of course, my love. What concerns you? Concerns me? She let out a mirthless chuckle, one that carried more weight than humor. I'm beyond concern, I am ensnared by trepidation. Our marriage bed has grown cold, and our conversations are empty. Bernard's brow creased ever so slightly, a testament to his disciplined facade. Eloise, you're painting a picture most dire. Am I? She cut him off. Or is it merely the reflection of truth? Taking a deep breath, she withdrew a bundle of papers from the folds of her gown. The evidence lay bare between them, letters, maps, a coded diary. Each item was a piece of the puzzle. Explain this. Her words were both a plea and a demand, the delicate balance of her emotions swaying like the pendulum of the grandfather clock nearby. Where did you find these? Bernard asked. Hidden away, where you thought they'd remain unseen. But I have seen, Bernard. Am I pawn in your Game of Thrones? Her voice cracked. Eloise, Bernard reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them, a bridge yet uncrossed. Speak the truth, Bernard. His hand fell to his side. In the heart of the palace, where whispers echoed through halls and truth was a currency rarely spent, Eloise stood ready to face the tempest her questions might unleash. She watched him, her heart caught in a vice of anticipation. The air between them was thick with the unsaid, the walls of the opulent study seemingly inching closer with each silent second that passed. Bernard, she entreated, her voice no more than a whisper now, yet carrying the force of a royal decree. We are beyond pretense, you and I. His mouth opened, then closed. Bernard's hands, those same hands that had once caressed her cheek with such tenderness, now balled into fists at his sides. The muscles along his jaw worked silently. Your silence speaks volumes, but it is words I need. A touch of mirth danced in her voice. Words, he echoed, his voice raw, as if the act of speaking caused him pain. You deserve words. Yes, I do. She took a step forward, closing the gap between betrayal and hope. Speak them. We need to clear the air between us. For a heartbeat's span, she thought she saw a glimmer of the man she had fallen in love with. But it was gone before she could be certain. Very well, he said at last, his voice steady as the roots of the ancient oaks lining the palace drive. But brace yourself, for the waters of truth may run deeper than you imagine. Chapter 14. Bernard paced the length of the hall. Eloise watched him, her eyes tracking his restless energy. Bernard, she called out, you're wearing a path in the rug. Whatever is troubling you, please share it with me." He stopped abruptly, his gaze locking with hers. In the grandeur of the chamber, heavy with the scent of fresh peonies, he appeared a conflicted prince, duty-bound yet burdened by secrets. He took a deep breath, and when he finally spoke, his words were laden with an earnest gravity that was uncharacteristic of his usually jovial demeanor. "Eloise," he began, "there's something I must confess. My uncle, the king, he's had me involved with the dissidents. Spying on them. Acting as one of them." Eloise felt a chill creep up her spine. She sat up straighter, her mind racing with the implications of his admission. The dissidents had been a thorn in the side of the monarchy for almost a year now, their discontent stirring the people into quiet murmurs of rebellion. "Involved," she echoed, the word tasting like betrayal on her tongue, though she couldn't equate the man she loved with someone who could betray a loved one. "Yes," Bernard continued, running a hand through his tousled chestnut hair. "It was necessary, to understand them, to stop the unrest before it could bloom into full-blown revolution. But it's delicate work, Eloise. Dangerous even. I didn't want you to even know about it, because I was afraid it would put you in danger. Then we shall continue this espionage together," she declared, rising to stand beside him. "We'll use our contacts, question our informants, and gather what intelligence we can on the dissidents. Caution will be our closest ally." Bernard looked at her, admiration mingling with affection in his gaze. "Together," he agreed. "Lord Marbury," Eloise said, smiling as she accepted a glass of champagne from a passing servant, "what rumors have graced your ears of late?" "Ah, Your Highness," Lord Marbury replied. "The usual trifles and gossip. Though I did hear whispers of discontent from the eastern provinces." "Discontent?" Bernard interjected smoothly. "Surely nothing a bit of royal attention couldn't soothe." "Yes, of course," Lord Marbury chuckled. Amid subterfuge, Bernard and Eloise found solace in humor and in each other, the love between them an unspoken promise to face whatever dangers lay ahead. Asterisk. The following day, Princess Eloise navigated the glittering throng with an ease born of countless state functions. Her gown shimmered with each step, a cascade of silken threads that seemed to drink in the lantern light, casting her in an ethereal glow. "Baroness Winterton," Eloise greeted. "The roses in your conservatory must be blooming marvelously this time of year." "They are, Your Highness," the Baroness replied. "But I fear the chill has driven more than my blooms indoors." "Ah, a metaphor for our troubled times?" Eloise ventured. A flicker of understanding passed between them, unspoken, but gravid with meaning. "Perhaps," the Baroness conceded, lowering her voice. "There are those who seek warmth in dangerous fires. Your wisdom is valued, Baroness." Eloise's reply was tinged with gratitude. She collected these coded confessions like precious stones, each one to be examined and appraised later, away from prying ears. Meanwhile, Bernard prowled through the underbelly of the city. The soft leather of his boots muffled his steps as he slipped through a narrow alleyway, his breath crystallizing in the frigid air. He paused at the mouth of a derelict tenement. With a deft hand, he withdrew a small contraption from his coat, a tiny marvel of engineering designed to pick locks with minimal fuss. Within moments, the door yielded, and he stepped into darkness. His eyes adjusted quickly, and he moved with precision, sidestepping debris and navigating the corridors by memory. At last, he reached a dimly lit room where the murmur of voices leaked through the cracks of an aged door. Pressing his ear against the wood, Bernard listened, the words of the dissidents within weaving a tapestry of sedition and anger. "More patrols," one voice grumbled. "They're tightening the noose." "Patience," another counseled. "Our friends in high places will see to it that our plans come to fruition." "Friends in high places," Bernard repeated internally, a sliver of ice sliding down his spine. This was the clue they needed, the confirmation that their movement had roots entangled in the upper nobility he and Eloise lived among. Withdrawing silently, Bernard made his escape, the whispers of traitors burning in his mind. It was a perilous game they played. For the sake of Theron and Allenia, for their future, and for the love that bound them together in this dance of shadows. Asterisk. In the secluded confines of a chamber adorned with the crests of Theron and Allenia, Eloise and Bernard huddled over a table strewn with letters, maps, and reports. The room, lit by the soft glow of candlelight, kept their clandestine activities veiled from prying eyes. Here, Bernard said, his finger tracing a line on the map. The riverbanks, they'd been using them for covert exchanges. Eloise leaned closer, her keen mind dissecting the patterns within the chaos. And here, look at this correspondence, the harvest will be bountiful. They are planning something significant. Yes, Bernard agreed, a wry smile tugging at his lips, despite the gravity of their situation. But when it comes to dissidents, I prefer a less agricultural approach to their uprisings. His attempt at humor was not lost on Eloise, who allowed herself a momentary grin before returning to the task at hand. We must anticipate their next move without revealing our hand, she mused aloud. Quite the conundrum, Bernard acknowledged, his gaze meeting hers. The dissidents didn't all trust me, and I was never allowed to know the name of the person who was heading the unrest here in Allenia. We all know it was Marquis Christopher in Theron, and he's in prison now. Their reverie was shattered by the sudden flurry of activity beyond the chamber doors. Muffled voices rose in agitation, the unmistakable cadence of confrontation seeping through the wood. Lord Marwick and Lady Sherrington, Eloise identified instantly. They've been too vocal in council meetings lately, questioning the integrity of our intelligence. Which means they could be our friends in high places aiding the dissidents, Bernard concluded, the pieces of the puzzle aligning with an almost audible click. We need to tread lightly, lest we step directly onto the viper's nest. Then we shall dance around it, Eloise declared. An intricate waltz of words and wits. Lead the way, Bernard said. Together, they exited the chamber, their steps synchronized, ready to confront the invisible forces that sought to undermine them. Remember, Bernard murmured, so softly that only she could hear, no matter how masterfully our enemies may play their game, they haven't accounted for one thing. And what is that? She whispered back, her eyes alight with the thrill of the challenge. Us, he replied simply, and in that single word, Eloise heard the promise of victory. Bernard's heart thrummed in his chest, a steady drumroll as he and Eloise stood before the innocuous-looking bakery, the scent of freshly baked bread wafting through the air. It was a front, they had learned, for the dissidents' secret rendezvous, a place where treason mingled with the aroma of pastries. Are you certain this is the location? Eloise's voice was low, her eyes scanning the street with royal acumen honed from years of courtly intrigue. Beyond doubt, Bernard replied. Our intel speaks of hushed meetings behind these walls. Then we proceed with the plan, she affirmed. Remember, you're to be my simple consort for the evening, nothing more. Ah, how quickly demotion strikes, Bernard quipped. Lead on, my cunning diplomat. They slipped through the door, the chime above announcing their entrance like a herald for clandestine affairs. Inside, a maze of corridors awaited, a labyrinth designed to confuse unwelcome guests. But Bernard and Eloise navigated with precision, having memorized the layout from a blueprint procured by one of their few remaining loyal contacts. Through here, Eloise whispered, guiding him toward a door, barely visible, beneath the stairwell. The faint sound of muffled voices seeped through the wooden barrier, coalescing into a symphony of sedition. Stay alert, Bernard murmured, feeling the weight of his concealed dagger against his thigh. I'll secure the evidence, you watch the exit. With a nod, Eloise took her position, her gaze sharp and vigilant. Bernard pushed the door open, slipping inside. The room was dimly lit, the flickering candles casting elongated shadows across the faces of those gathered. Maps and documents were strewn across a large table, each piece a thread in a tapestry of turmoil. Bernard crept closer, his fingers itching to snatch the papers, when a voice sliced through the tension. "Who are you?" Frozen, Bernard turned to see a man rising from his seat, suspicion etched into his furrowed brow. In an instant, Bernard assessed the threat, broad-shouldered, armed, and no stranger to conflict. "Merely a lost guest seeking the privy," Bernard said, his tone laced with the perfect blend of embarrassment and feigned inebriation. He staggered slightly for effect, eliciting a chuckle from another dissident. "Out with you, then," the man grumbled, pointing toward an adjacent door. Bernard offered a clumsy bow and stumbled out, but not before his fingers brushed against the parchment at the edge of the table, coaxing it into his sleeve with deft sleight of hand. Once outside, Eloise's questioning gaze met his. With a subtle lift of his eyebrow, he conveyed the success of his pilferage. They retreated from the bakery, emerging under the cover of night. "Your theatrics never cease to amaze," Eloise remarked, the corner of her lip quirking upward in amusement. "Every good spy needs a touch of the dramatic," Bernard replied. "Now, let us unveil the plot these traitors have so foolishly laid bare before us." Hand in hand, with evidence secured and hearts racing, they vanished into the velvet cloak of evening. Amidst the silent sentinels of ancient oaks in the royal gardens, Bernard and Eloise stood cloaked in shadows, their breaths misting softly in the crisp night air. The clandestine rendezvous they had engineered was fraught with peril, yet the weight of duty bore heavier on their shoulders than the danger that lurked. "Remember, caution above all," Bernard murmured, his hand finding hers. "Of course," Eloise replied. "But we must also be prepared for truths that sting more sharply than thorns." The rustle of foliage announced the arrival of their quarry. The man approached, his visage obscured by a hooded cloak. "Your Majesties," he intoned, his voice a hoarse whisper, betraying the strain of duplicity. "Dispense with the pleasantries," Bernard said. "We know of your involvement with the dissidents. What we seek is the puppeteer of this insidious theater." "Very well," he acquiesced, a tremulous sigh escaping him. "It's not out of loyalty to you or Allenia, but rather the hope for peace that I divulge. It is none other than—" His revelation unfurled like a banner in the tempest, echoing with the shock of betrayal and deceit. "Impossible," Eloise gasped, her diplomatic facade crumbling for a moment under the weight of incredulity. "How could it be?" "Silence!" Bernard hissed, his warrior instincts flaring to life. "This changes everything." As the informant melted back into the darkness, Bernard and Eloise exchanged a glance, a silent conversation of resolve and unspoken strategy. "Let us return to the palace," Eloise said. "We shall convene with our most trusted advisors. It is time to weave a web intricate enough to ensnare a mastermind." "Agreed," Bernard nodded, his mind already mapping the labyrinthine path ahead. "We will need support from both realms to quell this uprising. The unity of Theron and Allenia hinges upon exposing her." They retraced their steps toward the palace. Their plan would require the precision of a maestro and the cunning of a fox. "Imagine the look upon the face of our hidden foe when they realize the game is up," Eloise ventured. "It's going to be something to see," Bernard chuckled. "Your knack for diplomacy may just prove to be the checkmate our adversary never anticipated." Together, they plotted. And as dawn's first light began to banish the remnants of night, their laughter mingled with the songs of awakening birds. Asterisk. In the opulent drawing room of Allenia's royal court, a tempest brewed beneath the chandelier's twinkling light. Eloise's gaze locked onto Catherine's. Bernard stood by her side, his posture betraying nothing of the fury he must have felt toward his cousin. "Tell me, Catherine," Eloise began, her voice a blend of velvet and steel, "when did your ambition devour your loyalty?" Catherine's lips curled into a mirthless smile. "Loyalty is but a chain for fools, dear cousin-in-law. Power is the only currency that holds any true value." Bernard's hand found Eloise's. He leaned forward, his military poise as imposing as ever. You have endangered our nations for your own gain. How many lives are worth your crown? Enough pretense, Catherine spat. I will be the queen of a unified Theron and Allenia, and you can't stop me. But Eloise wielded words as her weapon. We already have, she stated. Your conspiracy is laid bare, and your supporters dwindle even as we speak. Your web of lies entangles you, Catherine, Bernard chimed in. The evidence of your machinations is irrefutable. The game has ended before you've even made your play. Catherine's eyes flashed with desperation, yet Eloise sensed the undercurrent of fear. It was almost pitiable. Your days of lurking in shadows are over, Bernard declared, his tone foreboding yet laced with the faintest trace of humor. It's time you basked in the spotlight of judgment. Guards! Catherine's voice was shrill. But the doors burst open, and it was not her guards who entered, rather, it was the very allies Eloise and Bernard had rallied. Your Highnesses, said the captain of the guard, bowing his head to Bernard and Eloise. We have come to help. Arrest her, Eloise instructed, pointing at Catherine. The command was simple yet carried the weight of kingdoms behind it. As the guards apprehended Catherine, Bernard turned to Eloise, admiration alight in his eyes. Your grace under fire never ceases to amaze me. And your unwavering courage is the compass that guides us, she replied, her lips curving upward. In the face of darkness, they were each other's beacon, their laughter the clarion call of triumph. Asterisk. The triumphant bells of Allenia's grand cathedral pealed across the kingdom, their resonant tones heralding a new chapter for two nations entwined by destiny and love. In the heart of the royal square, a sea of faces turned upward, toward the balcony where Eloise and Bernard stood side by side. Look at them, Eloise whispered, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. They're not simply celebrating our victory, they're reveling in the promise of a brighter future. Bernard slipped his hand into hers, the strength of his grip a testament to their shared resolve. A future we forged together, he replied. As they waved to their people, each gesture was an unspoken vow, a silent pledge to uphold the peace they had fought so ardently to secure. The royal banners danced merrily above. Later, as the festivities gave way to the tranquility of evening, Eloise and Bernard retreated to the stately confines of the palace library. Surrounded by the wisdom of ages, they found solace in the hush that enveloped them, a stark contrast to the day's exuberance. Remember when we were strangers, bound by duty? Eloise mused. And now, here we stand, united by so much more. Yes, Bernard acknowledged. I never imagined I would find my equal on the chessboard of court intrigue, let alone my life partner. Nor I, she conceded. Yet, amidst the lies and shadows, we discovered in each other kindred spirits. Perhaps it was fate, Bernard suggested. Or perhaps it was simply your relentless determination not to be outdone by a rogue prince with a penchant for dramatics. Ah, but you forget, Eloise retorted with a playful arch of her brow, it takes two to perform this dance of diplomacy and danger. Together, they twirled slowly amongst the rows of knowledge, their movements fluid and assured. Tomorrow, we begin the work of healing and building, Bernard said softly, his words a solemn oath to their united cause. But tonight, we celebrate us, the unity we represent and the love that has become our fortress. Eloise nodded, her heart swelling with the gravity of their shared journey. They had weathered the storm of conspiracy and emerged stronger for it. Here's to Theron and Allenia, she declared. May they flourish for centuries into the future. And to us, Eloise, Bernard added. With the echoes of their laughter mingling with the last whispers of twilight, Eloise and Bernard stood united. Asterisk. Eloise stepped onto the dew-kissed grass, Bernard by her side. They moved with purpose, their strides in sync as they surveyed the land that symbolized the unity of Theron and Allenia. Observe, Bernard murmured. Even the smallest creatures contribute to the grandeur of our kingdoms. Yes, Eloise replied, a smile playing upon her lips. The diligence of bees, unfettered by the complexities of politics, is enviable. Shall we then enlist an army of bees as our advisers? Bernard jested. I dare say they would offer rather sweet counsel. Only if they vow not to drone on during state affairs, Eloise quipped. Their banter was an affirmation of their shared resolve. As they walked hand in hand, they envisioned the initiatives they would undertake, programs to foster understanding between the citizens of their nations, cultural exchanges to celebrate their diverse heritages, and policies to ensure equitable prosperity. Education will be the cornerstone, Eloise said thoughtfully, pausing to admire a pair of butterflies dancing in the air. We'll need schools that not only teach, but also enlighten hearts and minds about the strength and unity. I would like for there to be higher education for all with free universities in our nations. An excellent start, Bernard agreed. And we must fortify the bonds between our people through collaboration. Joint ventures in trade, innovation, perhaps even the arts. Imagine, Eloise mused, her voice imbued with hope, a future where the children of Theron and Allenia grow up knowing nothing of the discord that once threatened us. More than imagine, my dear, we shall manifest it, Bernard declared. Together, we'll build a legacy that will endure for generations. They stood now at the heart of the garden, the burgeoning light enveloping them. Here, where the borders of their realms melded seamlessly, they pledged anew to their common cause. Let our love for our people be the guiding force, Eloise said. And let our laughter echo through the ages, Bernard added, the warmth of his grasp tightening around hers. As they turned back toward the castle, their silhouettes etched against the lightening sky, it was clear that the work they began today would indeed forge a brighter tomorrow for all. Chapter 15. The high ceiling of the king's private study loomed above them. Eloise glanced at Bernard, whose steadfast composure hid the emotions she knew were plaguing him. They were a pair summoned not for pleasantries, but for revelations most dire. Your Majesty, Bernard began, we have uncovered truths that weigh heavily upon our hearts. King Philip, seated behind an ornate desk that could rival a small ship in grandeur, looked up from a pile of documents, his eyes clouded with weary knowledge. Proceed, he intoned. Eloise stepped forward, the rustle of her skirts the only sound in the cavernous room. The dissidents, she said, are more entrenched than we feared. Their numbers are vast. The king's face remained an enigmatic mask as he listened, fingers steepled before him. Her heart thrummed a nervous rhythm, each beat a drumroll for the coming storm. Bernard unfolded the list they had compiled, his hand steady as he laid it before the king. And worse yet, he added, there are names here that will distress you. King Philip picked up the parchment, his gaze scanning the contents. A shadow seemed to pass over his visage, a fleeting moment of sorrow before the regal facade snapped back into place. My children, he murmured, a whisper that somehow filled the room with its profound grief. Indeed, sire, Bernard confirmed, his tone somber. To varying degrees, all four have been ensnared by this treacherous web. The air grew thick with unspoken words, the weight of a dynasty teetering on the brink of scandal. Eloise watched as King Philip rose, his movements slow, deliberate. Perhaps, King Philip said at last, it is time for the sun to set on my reign. He turned then, the decision etched into the lines of his face, a monarch confronting his own mortality. Bernard, do you comprehend what this means? Bernard met the king's gaze, his shoulders squared against the tide of history rushing toward them. I do, Your Majesty. It means, King Philip continued, his voice gaining strength, that you are next in line. You need to be the one to steer this kingdom out of turmoil. A silence fell over the room. Bernard's nod was barely perceptible, the acceptance of a burden he never sought but was born to bear. Then let it be so, King Philip decreed. Eloise's heart hammered against her ribcage, a frantic prisoner to the cage of her chest. She stood, stiff and regal, beside Bernard, as they absorbed the gravity of King Philip's words. Bernard, she began, a queen? I am not ready to be a queen. One of the things I like best about you is you were fifth in line to the throne. Bernard turned to her. But Eloise, destiny seldom knocks at convenient times. We must answer nonetheless. Destiny be damned, she replied with more force, feeling the bite of humor in her challenge, despite the solemnity of their predicament. I was content to stand by your side as a princess. But queen? It's like asking a peacock to pull a plow. A brief smile flickered across Bernard's lips. You underestimate yourself. And underestimate the strength of peacocks, it seems. Strength or not, Eloise countered, her gaze steady upon him. It is one thing to wear a crown in theory, quite another to bear the weight of it upon one's head. Then we shall bear it together, Bernard said, reaching for her hand. His touch was both reassuring and a tether to the reality they could no longer avoid. As they exited the palace, the heavy doors closing behind them with a thud, Eloise couldn't help but feel as if she were stepping through the looking glass. The marble steps, usually so solid underfoot, now seemed to wobble like the deck of a ship caught in a tempest. The air outside was brisk. They walked in silence, their thoughts a tangled maze that mirrored the intricate patterns of the royal gardens to their right. Whatever is to come, Bernard finally broke the silence, we will face it as we have everything else, united. United, yes, Eloise agreed. But at what cost? The morning sun streamed through the delicate lace curtains, casting golden patterns on the breakfast table where Eloise and Bernard sat opposite each other. Eloise reached for the silver teapot, her hand hesitating in midair as the butler placed the morning newspaper beside Bernard's plate with a respectful incline of his head. Asterisk. Bernard picked up the newspaper that was beside his plate at breakfast the following morning. The headline was emblazoned across the front page in bold, unforgiving type: King Philip abdicates, Prince Bernard ascends as Allenia's sovereign. His eyes scanned the article rapidly. Queen Eloise, the title loomed in print beside his image, and Eloise felt a flutter in her stomach. Finding out she was going to be queen shouldn't make her queasy, should it? Does it seem real to you yet? She asked, pouring the tea with a hand that betrayed no tremor. About as real as a dragon waltzing into the ballroom, Bernard quipped. He couldn't seem to look away from the headline. Perhaps we should train one for your coronation, Eloise suggested, her voice light. It would give the tabloids something to talk about other than our sudden ascent. Imagine the headlines then, he chuckled. But seriously, Eloise, how are you with all of this? He gestured vaguely toward the newspaper. Terrified, she admitted, setting down the teapot with care. I never wanted a crown, Bernard. I only ever wanted, her voice trailed off, leaving her deepest wishes unspoken. Me neither, he confessed, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his. You know what they say, though? Heavy is the head that eats the breakfast crumpets. Is that how it goes? Eloise laughed. Close enough, Bernard replied with a shrug. We'll rewrite the proverbs to suit us. We'll be unconventional rulers, you and I. Unconventional, she mused. I suppose that does have a certain ring to it. Rings, crowns, scepters, Bernard listed off, a playful glint in his eye. All the trappings of royalty, and yet here we are, more concerned with who will walk the corgis. Priorities, Eloise affirmed with a mock-serious nod. And speaking of, we must consider how this changes things for us, not just as monarchs, but as us. Us, he echoed softly. We've always been a team, haven't we? If anything, I think this will only make us stronger. Though I can't promise I won't accidentally knight someone when trying to butter my toast. Please reserve knighting for special occasions, she teased, grateful for the humor that eased the tension between them. We'll navigate this new chapter together, as we always have. With a bit of grace and a lot of laughter. Agreed, Bernard said, lifting his teacup in a mock toast. To us, to Allenia, and to unexpected adventures. To us, Eloise echoed, clinking her cup against his with a smile that was both brave and vulnerable, as they stepped into the roles history had thrust upon them. Bernard, she began, her voice steady, despite the churning in her stomach. I've always known that life could sweep us up into its grand designs, that I might someday wear a crown. But I imagined it would be in Theron, not here. Bernard's blue eyes met hers, the corners crinkling with a mixture of concern and curiosity. His hand reached out, enveloping hers on the tabletop, offering silent support. Eloise, he said. Wherever you are queen, whether in Theron or Allenia, your grace will illuminate the throne. Your humor has always been my anchor, Bernard, Eloise replied. And if I must be queen, I want it to be by your side. I will stand beside you, through every challenge and triumph. He squeezed her hand gently, a gesture loaded with gratitude and love. Asterisk. As morning gave way to afternoon, Eloise found herself alone in the sanctuary of their private chambers. The gilded mirrors and sumptuous fabrics that adorned the room seemed to mock her inner disquiet. She had been feeling off-kilter for over a month, an uneasiness she couldn't attribute solely to the political maelstrom they'd found themselves in. Retreating to the marble-clad bathroom, she pulled a small box from the cabinet, an unassuming object that held the power to alter all future expectations. The pregnancy test felt cool and foreign in her trembling hand. With a deep breath, she followed the simple instructions, her heart thundering against her rib cage. Minutes later, Eloise sat on the edge of the clawfoot tub, staring at the positive result. A complex tapestry of emotions unfurled within her, joy, fear, and an overwhelming sense of inadequacy at the timing. How could she burden Bernard with such news now? He was about to take on the mantle of a nation. No, she whispered to her reflection in the mirror. Not now. He needs to focus on Allenia, on becoming the king he was meant to be. The spark of new life within her would remain her secret. In the meantime, she would muster a smile and the unwavering support Bernard needed. Queen and mother-to-be, Eloise mused. Unconventional indeed. Asterisk. Amidst a whirlwind of silken gowns and polished silverware, Eloise watched as the palace transformed into their new abode. The servants, with deft hands and welcoming smiles, flitted through the grand hallways like a well-orchestrated ballet, placing personal effects and familial portraits with ease. Bernard's aunt and uncle, the former occupants of the palace, offered gracious nods as they departed for their estate. Eloise, Bernard called to her from where he supervised the arrangement of a particularly ornate tapestry. Do you think it should be a touch higher? Eloise tilted her head, considering the tapestry's new home above the mantelpiece. Perhaps just a smidgen, she said. We wouldn't want future generations straining their necks. Ah, but think of the posture improvements, he quipped back, his eyes sparkling with mirth as the servants adjusted the tapestry. The palace, once a distant, gilded cage in Eloise's eyes, slowly began to wrap around her like a warm, albeit majestic, embrace. She took solace in the thought, pushing aside the persistent flutter of trepidation that danced in her stomach. In the days that followed, the nobility of Allenia paraded through the palace doors, each pledging fealty to King Bernard with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Your Majesty, intoned Duke Harrowmont, his voice resonating through the throne room. I pledge my undying loyalty to your crown and country. Thank you, Duke Harrowmont, Bernard replied with practiced grace. Your support is invaluable to us. As each noble departed, Eloise couldn't help but detect the subtle undercurrents of curiosity and speculation. They were all wondering, no doubt, about the sudden shift in power, about her, the queen who had emerged from the shadows of political intrigue. Bernard, Eloise whispered later, as they retreated to the privacy of their chambers, do you ever feel like we're actors on a stage, playing parts scripted by fate? Every day, he confessed, taking her hand and kissing it gently. But if it's a play, then let's make it a comedy rather than a tragedy. We shall navigate this royal farce with wit and charm. Indeed, she agreed, the corners of her lips lifting, despite the heaviness in her heart. Yet, even as laughter escaped her, Eloise felt the secret within her growing heavier by the hour. The sun had long since surrendered to the velvet cloak of night, yet the light within the king's study refused to yield. Bernard sat, papers strewn before him like a legion in disarray. His eyes were etched with the fatigue of rulership, scanning line after line of the latest reports, a litany of names implicated in the conspiracy that had threatened to unravel the very fabric of Allenia. And the people caught were naming others, both in Allenia and in Theron. The sheer size of the conspiracy was larger than he'd dreamed it could be. Another baron? And 3 counts? Eloise asked from her position across the room. Yes, and I'm sad with each new friend that I hear was part of the unrest, Bernard replied without looking up. And they say the roots may spread deeper still. She moved toward him, her silk gown whispering secrets with each step. It's as if we're pruning a tree with infinite branches. Will we ever see it bear fruit again, I wonder? Ah, but my dear, even the mightiest oaks were once mere acorns, he quipped. We shall cultivate trust anew, though it requires the patience of a gardener and the diligence of a bee. Eloise couldn't help but smile. His sense of humor was one of her favorite things about him. Asterisk. As days turned to weeks, their shared laughter became a rare gem, sought after, but seldom found amidst the duties that demanded their attention. The king was often sequestered with advisers, while the queen-to-be orchestrated charitable endeavors, each endeavoring to mend the kingdom. Their conversations, once free-flowing rivers, became meandering streams choked by the sediment of statecraft. One evening Eloise wandered the pathways of the palace's garden alone, her thoughts a carousel that knew no end. The statues there, marble kings and queens locked in eternal regality, seemed to watch her with eyes that understood the solitude of sovereignty. Even stone companions offer more discourse than my living ones these days, she murmured, tracing the cold features of a queen who had reigned centuries before. A wry chuckle escaped her lips, though no one was there to hear it. In their bedchamber later that night, Eloise watched Bernard's chest rise and fall with the rhythm of slumber, his face softened by dreams. She reached out to brush a lock of hair from his brow. "Good night, my king," she whispered, a title that felt both familiar and foreign on her tongue. Tomorrow would bring with it another cascade of names. She dearly hoped they would find them all soon. The names always made them unhappy, but they all needed to be caught. But for tonight, she allowed herself the solace of his proximity, the quiet comfort that came with knowing they were still, at heart, simply Bernard and Eloise. Chapter 16. Bernard's chauffeur-driven car arrived at Château de la Paix, a majestic venue chosen for its neutrality and grandeur. Eloise, Princess of Theron and Queen of Allenia, stepped out, looking up at the enormous spires. "Steady on," murmured Sir Geoffrey, King Bernard's chief advisor. "Remember, we're here to build bridges, not admire the architecture." "Of course," Eloise replied. Beside her, King Bernard of Allenia stepped out of the car, his attire impeccable, his hair rebelliously tousled, a deliberate contrast to his stern-faced entourage. Bernard caught Eloise's eye, and a conspiratorial glint passed between them, a silent pledge to navigate the forthcoming storm with wit and poise. They'd talked about their strategy for this meeting ad nauseum. As they entered the grand hall, the air was thick with anticipation. Both Allenia and Theron had delegates at the meeting that hoped to shift the future of their countries. Eloise's senses were assaulted by the clinking of metals, the rustle of silk gowns, and the discreet murmur of hushed conversations. She scanned the room, noting the arrangement of chairs and tables designed to promote discourse, but also to serve as a buffer against any aggression. She gripped Bernard's hand and said a silent prayer there would be no hostility, though she knew she was fooling herself. "Seems we're at an impasse, before we've even begun," Bernard quipped softly, his voice a soothing balm amidst the undercurrent of unease. "Only if we choose to stand still," Eloise responded. "Shall we dance, then?" Lead the way, Your Highness, he said with a mock bow, drawing an amused chuckle from her. Together, they took measured steps toward the center of the hall, their advisors trailing behind. Let the games begin, Eloise whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Eloise stepped into the shaft of light that bisected the grand hall, her silhouette commanding attention as she ascended the dais. The hushed whispers of the assembly gave way to silence. All eyes were riveted upon her. With Bernard at her side, they stood as twin bastions of hope against a backdrop of uncertainty. Esteemed delegates, Eloise began, her voice carrying the weight of her conviction, we stand at the intersection of history and destiny. Theron and Allenia have not always seen eye to eye, but we share more than borders. We share bloodlines, artistry, and the very grains of soil that nurture our lands. Bernard watched her with a blend of admiration and affection. When it was his turn to speak, he matched her passion with sincerity. Our nations are like two great trees, roots entangled beneath the earth, branches sometimes clashing in the wind. Yet we reach for the same sunlight, thrive on the same rain. It is time for Theron and Allenia to grow together rather than apart. The assembly murmured in response, some nodding thoughtfully, others still holding on to their reservations like treasured heirlooms. But the warmth of their words had begun to soften the permafrost of decades-long disputes. Perhaps, Eloise suggested, a mutual exchange of scholars could enrich both our cultures. Let knowledge be the currency that binds us. An excellent proposition, Bernard concurred, his mind agile as he expanded on her idea. And what if we were to celebrate a shared festival, commemorating our intertwined histories? Whispers of intrigue rippled through the delegation, the once rigid faces beginning to crease with cautious optimism. Eloise's gaze met Bernard's, and a silent message passed between them, a shared joke about the theatricality of politics, a tinge of wonder at their unfolding camaraderie. With each compromise proposed, the space between the two sides seemed to shrink, the buffer of chairs and tables less a barricade and more a bridge. Laughter even made a brief appearance when Bernard playfully suggested an alliance through marriage, not to any particular individual, but as a historical precedent meant to lighten the mood. Ah, yes, Eloise chimed in, a union of hearts and crowns, a tale as old as time. But let us first forge a bond of trade and trust, shall we? As the afternoon waned, people seemed happy with their consensus. Each concession carved out from the marble of pride, each agreement a brushstroke on the canvas of a new beginning. Eloise and Bernard painted the possibility of a world where Theron and Allenia existed not as adversaries, but as allies. Asterisk. By the following morning, the grand hall trembled with discontent as whispers coiled, like serpents, through the representatives. Eloise stood poised at the epicenter, her keen gaze slicing through the murmurs that threatened to crescendo into chaos. The factions within Theron and Allenia were not so easily swayed by the prospect of peace. Your Majesty, a voice boomed, the timbre rich with disdain. Your idealism is charming, but naive. How can we trust a nation that has been our rival for centuries? Eloise's countenance remained serene, though her mind raced. She looked at Bernard. Together, they were determined to end the strife between their nations. Trust, she began, her voice a silken thread weaving through the tension, is not a gift freely given, but a treasure earned through deeds and time. Theron would like to move hand in hand with Allenia, into a future where our children won't inherit our rivalry. A murmur of agreement fluttered from a corner of the room. Bernard stepped forward commanding silence. Consider the alternative, he urged. We have bled enough for barren pride. It is time to heal, to build rather than destroy. This is no mere ceasefire. It is a true uniting of our people. One obstinate representative rose. And what of our economies, the markets that thrive on conflict? Peace is a lofty goal, but what of the cost? Bernard's smile was a subtle play of light, disarming yet sharp. Ah, but think of the boon, he countered with a buoyant lift of his brow. Imagine the prosperity when trade routes open. We are merchants of the future here, and peace is our most valuable commodity. Eloise then addressed the room with a warmth that reached even the coldest skeptic. Peace is an investment, she concurred. An investment in our people, in progress, in the kind of prosperity that cannot be measured in coin but in the currency of hope and harmony. The tide of resistance seemed to calm ever so slightly. The dance of diplomacy continued as Eloise and Bernard wove through the political minefield with a grace that belied the gravity of their task. Each objection was met with reason, buoyed by the laughter that reminded them of their humanity. Eloise stood at the head of the long oak table, her fingers lightly grazing the embossed edges of the proposal that could alter the fate of two nations. Esteemed delegates, she began, we stand at the cusp of a new dawn. The room fell silent, every eye fixed upon her. Theron and Allenia have been estranged siblings for far too long, Bernard continued. It is time we acknowledge our mutual interests and the abundance that unity will bring. Eloise unfolded the document before them, revealing page after page of meticulous clauses and stipulations. What we're presenting here is not merely a treaty but a testament to cooperation. A comprehensive trade agreement that promises growth, security, and an enduring alliance between our realms. Murmurs swelled once more. Some faces bore the etchings of old grudges, eyes narrowed, mouths set in hard lines. Yet Eloise's poise never wavered. Her belief in their shared future was unshakable. Consider the artisans of Theron, she implored. Their craftsmanship deserves a wider audience, the chance to grace the homes of Allenia. And the fertile groves of Allenia, Bernard chimed in, shall yield their bounties, blessing the tables of Theron with nature's splendor. Chapter 17. The royal balcony offered a beautiful view of Allenia. Bernard stood there, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze lost in the serenity of his kingdom. The weight of the crown often pressed heavily upon his shoulders, but at this moment, the burden seemed to lift. Eloise stepped softly to his side. She nestled herself under his arm, her head finding its familiar nook against his shoulder. Bernard, she began. Now that the peace talks have concluded with such success, do you find yourself breathing easier? Her eyes sought his, asking the question that her heart already knew the answer to. Bernard's posture eased as he turned to regard her, the corners of his mouth tilting upward in a smile. Yes, he admitted. It appears that diplomacy has triumphed. It's a fine night for our people, don't you think? Absolutely, Eloise chimed in, her laughter like music to his ears. And a fine night for us as well, I'd say. Her fingers traced an idle pattern on the rich fabric of his jacket. Peace, prosperity, and, most importantly, a quiet evening just for the two of us, she continued, her teasing glance implying that the latter was a rare treasure indeed. Quiet, but not entirely devoid of surprises, I hope. Bernard quipped back. Surprises? Eloise echoed, feigning innocence. Whatever do you mean? I'm simply enjoying the stillness with you, my king. But the twinkle in her eye betrayed her. Bernard reached for Eloise's hand, drawing her closer to his side. He gazed out across the twinkling lights of their kingdom, each one a silent testament to the peace they had achieved together. Stress is a peculiar beast, he mused, his voice a soft rumble against the quiet of the evening. It tends to loom large and foreboding, yet in your presence, my dearest, it shrinks away to nothing. He smiled down at her. With you by my side, I fear no challenge or burden. Eloise met his warm gaze. Oh, Bernard, there is such comfort in your words, she said, her voice carrying a tremor. And yet, I find myself having kept a secret, one that I'm afraid will change our lives forever. A question sparked in Bernard's eyes. Eloise took a deep breath. I have known for over 6 weeks now, she began, that I'm expecting the future king or queen of Allenia. She paused, there was no pulling back now. She said a silent prayer that he would be as happy as she was about the impending birth of their child. I feared, she continued, to add to the weight of your crown during the peace talks. Please forgive me for not saying something sooner. The stillness that followed was filled with the gravity of her revelation. Bernard stood motionless. 6 weeks, he echoed. His hand, ever so tenderly, came to rest upon her belly, as if to greet the child within. Oh, Eloise, he whispered, how could I be anything but ecstatic? I hope she has your eyes. I hope he has your penchant for pacing. He leaned down and kissed her softly. We're really having a baby. Bernard led Eloise back into the warmth of the palace. As they moved through the grand hallway, his stride faltered just for a moment, a silent testament to the emotions he was feeling. Betrayal is a heavy word, he said at last. Yet, I cannot deny the flicker of it in my heart, Eloise. She looked up at him, her eyes pools of moonlit sincerity. I never meant. I know, Bernard interrupted. You are the compass by which I navigate this life. It was your love that whispered caution, not deceit. He shook his head. And I cannot deny that I love you with all my heart. That's why I asked for your hand. Not because I wanted to bring our countries together. His fingers brushed against hers. And you have given me more happiness than any peace treaty ever could. And I love you, my king, she said with a sweet smile. I don't know why I didn't see it at first, but there's no doubt in my mind now. We're partners in every part of our lives. Asterisk. A week later, the kingdom buzzed with whispers of the news that had yet to be officially announced, and soon Bernard and Eloise found themselves in the cool, sterile room of the royal physician. The hum of modern machinery seemed out of place against the backdrop of ancient tapestries, but there they were, side by side, awaiting the first glimpse of their future. Are we certain we don't want to know? Eloise asked, a playful quirk to her lips as she lay on the examination table, her hand finding Bernard's. Absolutely, he affirmed with a smile. Let this be one surprise not dictated by crown or council. The physician moved the sonogram device with practiced ease, and the static-filled room was suddenly filled with the rhythmic sound of a tiny heartbeat. It was a sound that transcended titles and territories, a simple declaration of life that united them. Strong and steady, the doctor remarked. Much like its parents, Bernard said as he squeezed Eloise's hand, both of them awestruck by the image before them. They shared a look that spoke volumes, forgetting for a moment that they weren't just husband and wife, but instead king and queen. As they left the physician's quarters, stepping once more into the grandeur of their palace, it was with lighter hearts. This child, a symbol of their unity, would someday inherit not only a throne but the laughter and love upon which it was built. Asterisk. Bernard paced the length of the opulent receiving hall, his usual stoic demeanor abandoned for an almost childlike gleam in his eyes. Underneath the weighty gold of his crown, his hair was tousled, not from disregard but from the number of times he had raked a hand through it in barely contained excitement. The people present cast each other knowing glances, indulging in the rare sight of their sovereign so visibly unguarded. Darling, Bernard called out as Eloise entered the room, her own face alight with a soft radiance that only added to her charm. Have you heard? They say there hasn't been such elation since our coronation. Eloise laughed, the sound like music in the vast chamber. I believe they might be even more excited. After all, a baby brings hope, not just pomp and ceremony. True, very true. Bernard exclaimed, sweeping her into his arms and spinning her around once, heedless of the stately surroundings or the amused whispers of the court. Hope for our future, for Allenia's future. He leaned down and kissed her, ignoring their audience. And for Theron's. Bernard's gaze softened. Tomorrow, he continued, we announce to the world the impending arrival of the next sovereign. Can you fathom it, my love? In 4 short months, our lives will change forever. Eloise's hand came to rest upon her growing belly, her smile a tender curve of shared dreams and aspirations. Our child will be the symbol of unity, the heir to a throne stronger because it stands on the foundation of two nations. His fingers traced the line of her jaw gently as if she were a treasure. Tonight, then, Eloise suggested. We draft the announcement, and by morning, all of Allenia will know of our news. Perhaps I should let my family know before the announcement is made. They stood together, king and queen, partners in love and leadership, anticipating the following day when the palace would issue forth a proclamation that would echo throughout history. It was a declaration that the tiny heartbeat they'd heard, strong and steadfast, would carry forth the message of peace and unity between their kingdoms. As they walked side by side, they knew they were crafting a future as bright and promising as the laughter of their soon-to-be-born child. Epilogue. Eloise shifted gently in the soft armchair, cradling the bundle that had, mere hours ago, emerged to alter the course of their lives. The nursery, a haven of pastel hues and golden accents, was filled with the coos and gentle gurgles of the infant, sounds that were magical to her ears. "Isn't she just exquisite?" Eloise murmured, her gaze never departing from her daughter. The baby's fingers curled around Eloise's own. Bernard, standing beside her with a posture softened by awe, nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "More than words can capture," he agreed, the timbre of his voice imbued with a warmth that spread through the room like the first rays of dawn. He leaned closer and pressed a soft kiss upon the baby's forehead. A crown rested askew on Bernard's head, a testament to his hasty departure from the council meeting as soon as he heard the news that his wife was in labor. Their eyes met over the downy head of their child, and laughter danced in Eloise's sapphire eyes. "Do you think she'll inherit your knack for arriving just in the nick of time?" she teased. "Or your impeccable sense of timing that keeps an entire kingdom on its toes?" Bernard quipped back. Asterisk. Whispers of silk and muted chuckles filled the royal nursery as a procession of nobles and cherished companions filed in, their expressions filled with the warmth of celebration. "May her laughter be the music that guides your days," intoned Lady Marianne, an old friend of Eloise's mother, her eyes crinkling with mirth. "May she inherit her father's wisdom and her mother's grace," offered Sir Geoffrey, an advisor to Bernard, his gaze twinkling beneath bushy brows. Eloise, still cradling the infant, received each accolade with a nod and a smile. Bernard stood by her side, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, a silent pillar of support. A gentle hush descended as King Albert and Queen Beatrice approached, the gravity of their presence parting the crowd like a ship cutting through calm waters. Their faces, usually so composed in the face of duty, now revealed a different kind of sovereignty, one tempered by tenderness. "Dearest daughter, and esteemed son," King Albert began. "This little one is part of two great nations, and she is what our countries need to completely heal old wounds." "I agree," Queen Beatrice affirmed, bending to place a kiss upon the baby's velvety cheek. "She is the perfect blend of Theron and Allenia's hope. Our second grandchild, and we are beyond grateful, for she is the legacy of peace we shall leave behind." The king and queen stepped back, clasping hands as they joined the circle of well-wishers. The room breathed in unison, a collective sigh of contentment, every heart entwined in the moment's significance. "Perhaps she'll wield the diplomatic charm of her grandfather, or the astute resolve of her grandmother," Bernard said. "Or perhaps," Eloise replied, her laughter bubbling up like a clear spring, "she will surpass us all, forging her own path. As long as she loves books as much as I do, I know she'll be happy." In the bright eyes of the infant princess lay not just the promise of two kingdoms united, but the enduring power of a love that had already conquered much and promised even more. That morning, as people throughout Allenia woke and went about their business, they all read the news the entire nation had been waiting for. Queen Eloise and King Bernard are blessed with new life, a baby girl, heir to the throne, and symbol of unity. From the cobblestone streets to the rolling fields beyond, the news cascaded like a joyous melody. The people of Theron, from bakers to blacksmiths, donned their finest attire and filled the air with exuberant cheers. Bunting in shades of gold and blue, signifying both Theron and Allenia, fluttered from windows and wrapped around lampposts, as if the very buildings themselves were celebrating. In Allenia, the announcement was met with equal fervor. Eloise could hardly contain a giggle as Bernard attempted to wave regally to the throngs of well-wishers. His usual stoic demeanor had given way to an uncharacteristic buoyancy, and his arm seemed to have developed a mind of its own, much to the amusement of both his wife and onlookers. "Bernard, darling," Eloise whispered, "you look as though you're conducting an orchestra rather than greeting your people." "Ha! And you, my love," he returned with a grin, "bear the grace of a queen and the mischievous spark of a jester. Our daughter has inherited quite the realm." Together, they traversed the streets, their infant swaddled in a blanket embroidered with the intertwined crests of their nations. The baby content in her carriage. Each village square became a theater of jubilation. Everyone was happy that the next Queen of Allenia had been born. May she grow to be as wise as King Philip and as kind-hearted as Queen Rachel. A baker exclaimed as she offered a tray of sweets shaped like doves and olive branches. May she lead us into a future where Theron and Allenia are not just allies but family, a farmer added. The journey took them through valleys and up winding hills, from the bustle of city centers to the quiet of the countryside. With each step, the prince and princess grew ever more cognizant of the depth of their responsibility, not only to their child but to the hopes of their people. "Look at them, Bernard," Eloise murmured as they paused to admire a mural depicting their wedding day, now completed with a cherubic infant painted into the scene. "They believe in us, in her, so fiercely." "Then we must be worthy of that belief," Bernard replied firmly. "We will do all we can to believe it ourselves, and more importantly, we will teach her to believe it. She will not betray her country as my cousins have." The laughter of the crowd followed them, a testament to the love that had transcended borders and titles. In the eyes of every citizen, there was a spark, an undeniable recognition that the baby princess was far more than just an heir. She was the living proof that love, when paired with compassion and strength, could indeed build a legacy that would echo through the ages. Asterisk. Eloise's fingers traced the delicate contours of their child's face, following the soft curve of a rosy cheek with the gentlest touch. A coo slipped from the infant's lips. In response to this precious noise, Eloise leaned closer, her heart swelling so immensely it threatened to breach the confines of her chest. "Did you hear that, my love?" she whispered, her voice buoyant with wonder. She is already speaking in her own way, as if she knows the language of joy. Bernard stood by, his gaze fastened on the two loves of his life with an intensity that bordered on reverence. He reached out, his finger gently coaxing another smile from their baby girl, who chuckled softly when she grasped his finger in her tiny hand. "Strong grip," Bernard observed, a note of pride threading his words. "A sign of her future resolve, perhaps? Or simply her way of telling her papa that she will never let go," Eloise replied. Amid the laughter, the nursery door opened to reveal a servant carrying yet another ornate package wrapped in silk ribbons. The room was awash with tokens of affection, plush toys embroidered with the crests of distant lands, woven blankets bearing messages of peace, and silver rattles engraved with wishes for prosperity. Each gift was a testament to the goodwill that had flourished since the birth of their daughter. "From the Sultan of Serafina," the servant announced, placing the gift among its lavish counterparts. "Please extend our heartfelt thanks to the Sultan," Bernard said. "We are humbled by the generosity that has been shown to us, not only as royalty but as parents." "Yes," Eloise agreed, her gaze sweeping over the nursery filled with well wishes. "To know our child will be embraced by such warmth from every corner of the earth, it gives me hope that she shall grow up in a world where love is the greatest currency." "May it be so," Bernard murmured. Asterisk. Courtiers lined the grand hall, their whispers fading into silence as Queen Eloise, resplendent in her gown of emerald, stepped forward cradling the symbol of a new era in her arms. King Bernard, his uniform adorned with the medals of both Theron and Allenia, stood by her side. "Dear friends," Eloise began. "We stand before you today with hearts brimming over." "We do," Bernard said, his hand resting lightly on Eloise's shoulder. "We are here to present not only our beloved daughter, but the future shared between our nations." A collective breath was held as they unveiled the name chosen for the tiny princess, who slept, unaware of her profound significance. "She shall be known as Princess Amara Beatrice Victoria," Eloise announced, a name signifying eternal beauty and strength in Theron, and peace and grace in Allenia. "And of course, her middle names are for her grandmothers." Bernard's gaze swept over the gathered crowd. "It is our deepest hope that Amara will embody the best of both our lands," he said. "And in her, may the promise of a united future flourish." Applause erupted, reverberating off the marble walls. Laughter mingled with the clapping, a sound that resonated with the very stones of the palace, echoing the sentiment of a hopeful people. As the applause settled into a joyful murmur, the royal photographer arranged the family for a ceremonial portrait. "If we could all nestle a tad closer," he instructed, stepping back to frame the shot. "Am I to assume nestle is the technical term?" Bernard quipped, drawing a gentle chuckle from Eloise. "Perfect," the photographer declared, his lens capturing the moment. The flash immortalized their smiles, the closeness of their bodies, and the tender way Eloise held Amara against her heart. "Let this portrait be a beacon of hope," Eloise whispered, her words for Bernard alone amidst the quiet shuffling of the court's departure. "Hope," he agreed, his eyes reflecting the love he held for both his wife and child, "and proof that our greatest legacy will always be love." Asterisk. Later, in the nursery, Bernard stood over Eloise's shoulder as she sat by the crib. Their hands intertwined, and both sets of eyes were drawn to the tiny face that peeked out from the bundle of lace and silk. "Can you believe it, Bernard?" Eloise mused, her voice a hushed whisper. "From the rigid formality of our first meeting to this miracle cradled between us." "Yes," Bernard replied. "It is as though fate took an ironic delight in crafting a love story for us." His thumb caressed the back of her hand. Peace between Theron and Allenia was once but a lofty ambition, Eloise reflected. Her eyes, bright with unshed tears, met his. "And now, it breathes and giggles in our arms." "More than peace, my love," Bernard countered. "Our Amara is the proof of our unity." Their shared laughter filled the nursery, as hearty and warm as the hearth fires that burned in the grand fireplaces below. In the quiet aftermath, they settled into a comfortable silence, the language of their hearts speaking volumes in the spaces between breaths. Years passed, and the chapters of their lives unfolded like the petals of a rose in the royal gardens. Eloise, Bernard, and Amara lived days rich with love. The people of Allenia looked upon their rulers not merely with respect, but with affection. When 3 years after Amara's birth, twin boys were born to them, the boys were celebrated, but not in the same way Amara had been. Amara felt as if she was a symbol for both nations. Their oldest child grew under the nurturing light of her parents' love and the watchful eyes of nations that celebrated every milestone, from her first steps in the grand hall to the day she spoke words of unity to an audience of both nations. In the end, the legacy of Eloise and Bernard was not etched in stone or written in the annals of history, but lived in the thriving pulse of their lands. And every day Eloise promised herself that one day, she would write about her own love story, a story that had changed the course of not just 2 lives, but 2 entire nations.